The truth of the matter is, RFK Jr. is not equipped to talk about this issue at all either. He's incredibly uninformed on the topic.
Israel, on the other hand, only deliberately attacks military targets.
That is belied by the fact that every major human rights organization once again documents the fact that Israel engages in, quote, reckless and deliberate killings and indiscriminate bombings of civilian areas.
If you're making a special category to criticize Israel.
Frankly, Israel should be singled out because, as I mentioned, the longest military occupation in modern history.
There's 1.9 million Palestinians in Israel who vote. They elect legislatures.
The idea that Israel is a democracy in the first place, let alone the only democracy, is a sham.
If you kill a Jew anywhere in the world and you're a Palestinian, the Palestinian Authority will pay you money for that.
I mean, it does not even pass the smell test. You just hear that and you don't know whether to laugh or cry that somebody can make that claim in seriousness. It is completely baseless. It has no relationship to reality whatsoever.
All right. What a pleasure to be joined by Palestinian American political activist, expert, Omar Baddar. Welcome to Bad Faith for the first time, Omar.
Very excited to be on, Briahna. Thank you.
So I've asked you to talk to me today because I think a lot of the left has really been blown away by the nature, and not in a good way, by the way, but by the nature of RFK Jr.'s various responses in various interviews, both with me on Rising at the end of last month and more recently on the Jimmy Dore show, as he's asked specifically about the issue of Israel-Palestine. The first inkling that he might have views that depart significantly from the broad feelings on the American political left, even among many political liberals, came after he withdrew his support of Roger Waters after he apparently received some criticism of the idea that Roger Waters was anti-Semitic for the protests of Palestinian treatment during his concerts. Instead of defending Roger Waters, he walked it back and first appeared with Rabbi Shmuley, who seems to have a close relationship with RFK Jr. and has been a repeated presence by his side for after every other time, rightly or wrongly, that RFK Jr. has been accused of anti-Semitism. And moreover, he, because of those instances, has been asked repeatedly, both by me and by Jimmy Dore most recently, to explain and unpack why it seems that he speaks about Palestine in a way that reflects, as Marianne Williams put it, APAIC talking points from like 10 years ago, not even recent APAIC talking points. So let's get into it. My observation is that many people on the left, while they have a instinctive and visceral reaction to RFK Jr. statements, don't necessarily have the knowledge base to push back specifically in the way that some people might have wanted. I know there was a lot of pushback after the Jimmy Dore interview. Jimmy Dore admitted that he, didn't feel comfortable or well-versed enough to push back as thoroughly as he wanted to. He seemed to know, to his credit, that the things that RFK Jr. were saying weren't correct, were deeply problematic, but wasn't as well-versed in the history, et cetera, as RFK Jr. seemed to be.
But I'm not I'm not an expert.
And you can sue people for it.
Okay. So I get your defense of Israel.
And they will.
I don't know enough to push back on this. I'm the least informed guy to push back on you on this, right? But I have to try a little.
So I thought it was a really important teaching moment for the left to not just know instinctively when someone is talking in ways that seem disrespectful to a community, but specifically to understand why it is that RFK Jr. was wrong from a historical perspective, et cetera. So thank you for joining me for that purpose, Omar.
Of course, more than happy to. And the thing that you pointed out, Briahna, about sort of Jimmy Dore not being as well equipped to talk about this issue as RFK Jr. is, the truth of the matter is RFK Jr. is not equipped to talk about this issue at all either. He's incredibly uninformed on the topic. He makes wild claims that are not based in reality. But his style, he speaks with such confidence that even though the facts don't really check out, if you can fact check him, there is this aura of this person has to know what they're talking about just because of the way that he speaks about it. And that's kind of what's concerning for me, is that given that his general framework is one of, taking on the corporate machine, the pro-war machine on big pharma, that all instinctively has natural appeal for progressives for good reason.
Yeah.
And then when he speaks with such authority on this issue, people may be inclined to take it at face value, but really it's honestly incredibly jarring to kind of realize that he's using one extreme right-wing talking point after the other, and that the history is entirely jumbled up. I mean, I wish I could put it more delicately, but he simply just does not know what he's talking about, but still speaks about it very, very confidently.
Yeah, and to that point, I mean, one thing that I'll say in Jimmy Dore's credit during that interview is that he did say, look, I know that I'm out of my depth, but will you debate someone like Max Blumenthal, who's written several books on the subject and done so much reporting on the subject? And in the moment, RFK Jr. agreed.
I love Max Blumenthal, but I do not think he's objective on Israel. I think his reporting on Israel is not it needs to be questioned.
Okay, well, here's what I would ask. Just like, Peter Hotez ducked you and Joe Rogan, I would love, because Max is the guy to talk to about this, not me. So would you do an interview with Max, because he would be able to talk to you about this way better than I can. I'm really not good at this.
Yeah, I would love to talk to Max.
Yeah, I mean, Max is a great guy. He's he's a straight shooter.
Subsequently, I broke a little bit earlier in this week. Max was on Rising to talk about another subject, and I asked him what the status was of his discussion with RFK Jr., and he had heard from a member of RFK Jr.'s campaign that he was no longer willing to have that conversation. I hope that that's wrong. I hope that that changes going forward. I'm not holding my breath. Certainly, if I worked for RFK Jr. and he sincerely held the beliefs that he seems to sincerely hold, I wouldn't have him go toe-to-toe with someone like Max Blumenthal. But before we get into it, Omar, can you tell me and the audience why you are well-versed in this subject?
So I'm obviously Palestinian American. So I grew up in the Middle East. My family is Palestinian on both sides. And this issue is deeply impactful, on me on a personal level. My mother's family was driven out of what became Israel in 1948. She was born in Syria shortly after. My father's family driven out from the West Bank in the 1967 occupation of the West Bank. And it's just kind of growing up as a Palestinian, unable to return home, moving around one country to another in the Middle East and eventually to the US. I mean, it's hard not to have that direct tie. And as I became more and more educated about it, kind of the US role, it's so significant that it's very difficult to live in the United States without being constantly hit in the face about how how sharp the contrast is between American rhetoric about human rights and democracy and freedom, and how American policy on the question of Palestine and Israel is the exact opposite of that. And you have this contrast, just a level of hypocrisy that is quite bewildering. And rarely do people hold politicians' feet to the fire. Rarely does the media cover this issue accurately. And I think that becomes a natural motivation for people who are deeply connected to this issue to feel like there is a void. People don't know about this issue, and it's important to get the truth out about it. So,
well, let's start there, because something that RFK Jr. frequently says, he said it to me on Rising a couple of weeks ago, is that while he does not think that any criticism of Israel as a nation is anti-Semitic and that he rejects that, he characterizes as anti-Semitic a disproportionate focus on Israel, and argues that many people who are critical of Israel, who would call it an apartheid state or racist state, which was, were the terms in dispute a couple of weeks ago with this congressional censorship, don't talk about other human rights abuses in the region, in the rest of the Middle East and the Arab world.
Israel last year had more condemnation by the UN official resolutions than all nations combined, more than Myanmar, more than China, more than any other nation. Everybody is signaling out Jews, and I would say that's anti-Semitism. If you're criticizing Israel and not applying the same standards to neighboring states or other states, in other words, if you're making a special category to criticize Israel that's unique to Israel and letting all the other states do the worse, much worse. That then evinces a bias.
So what do you say first and foremost to that characterization? Do you think that there is an argument that progressives or others are disproportionately focusing on human rights abuses by Israel? Or does it have something to do with what my response to him was, which was, I think that there is a disproportionate interest in what U.S. aid goes to fund or what U.S. aid furthers, and our financial relationship with Israel is unique in the region.
Yeah, I think certainly the latter. And I'll just point out that he initially made that accusation of anti-Semitism, directed it at Ilhan Omar, on the grounds that she's not criticizing other governments in the region. And that's just factually incorrect. She's extremely critical of Saudi Arabia, has been on record, has been attacked for it. So this idea that she's exclusively focused on Israel is simply not true. Also, he criticized her for saying that it's all about the Benjamins in reference to the Israel lobby using its financial influence to influence American policy in a negative direction. That is the story of American politics. That is the story of the fact that we have special interests across the board that use their financial influence to steer policy in a negative direction. We see it in corporate influence, we see it in the defense industry, in big pharma, and in a bunch of other things. And this idea that the Israel lobby specifically is an exception to that is really laughable. And that pointing out the obvious, which is that APAIC itself brags about its influence in Congress, that they don't use the same tactics as every other lobbying group, and to somehow characterize that as anti-Semitic is very, very deeply problematic and frankly defamatory and slanderous. It's a very serious charge, and the extent to which this charge is politicized to try to suppress criticism of Israel, I think, is a serious challenge in U.S. political culture that we have to confront. But
so you brought up growing up, being aware of U.S. involvement in the region. Can you unpack that a little bit for us from your perspective? How deep, how responsible is the United States for the conditions under which Palestinians currently live?
Sure. I mean, the U.S. is the single most significant supporter for Israel and Israeli policy. And for the longest time, American policy on paper has been one of supporting Palestinian statehood and opposing Israeli occupation. But in practice, it could not be farther from that. That was not the case at all. There was also that significant hypocrisy. In terms of actions, the U.S. gives Israel unprecedented levels of military funding. Right now, it's close to $4 billion every single year, that every leading American politician brags about as being unconditional. When Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren were floating the idea of maybe conditioning some of that aid on making sure that Israel does not use it to violate Palestinian human rights, the Biden administration was outraged and said, no, we would never condition military funding for Israel. So we're treating Israel as a country above the law, that they can get all this military funding and they never have to account for how they use it, even though Israel is carrying out the longest military occupation in modern history. They've been illegally occupying Palestinian territories for over 50 years. And it goes back even further when you talk about the founding on Israel and the atrocities that were committed against Palestinians there, the massive displacement and everything else. And the same is true of American diplomatic support, where the U.S. has used its veto at the UN more than 50 times to curtail accountability or criticism of Israel at the UN. And just to put that in perspective, that is greater than the number of all vetoes cast by all other members of the Security Council combined on all issues for that same period, from the 70s until today. That also is a policy that makes no sense. We can't simultaneously preach freedom and democracy and human rights while we're actively arming an illegitimate and illegal occupation that is brutalizing Palestinians and denying them their freedom. That is effectively what American policy is. But Briahna, I just want to go to a specific point on this issue of whether Israel is being singled out. Frankly, Israel should be singled out because, as I mentioned, the longest military occupation in modern history, and a system that every major human rights organization at this point acknowledges is a system of apartheid, is what they rule over Palestinians with. Those are indeed exceptional crimes that are deserving of exceptional focus. And to your point, the fact that these are crimes that the U.S. is funding and arming and supporting to the extent that they are obviously merits a lot more attention from the American public.
So I want to go back just to put a highlight the word unconditional, the unconditional support, specifically That's language that RFK Jr. has used, and it's language that I specifically asked him about when he was on Rising. And we should insert his reply here in all fairness to him, so you can hear his response to that in his own words.
How do you square a condemnation of some of those actions on the part of the Israeli government, which we send so much money to, with what you've said before, which is that you have this, quote, unconditional support? How can you, and when we have this monetary relationship with Israel, also support unconditional support while having the ability to criticize the actions of a government?
Well, by unconditional support, I don't mean that I'm going to co-sign every action by Netanyahu or Likud or whatever, or the settlements, or a particular settlement or a particular policy. I don't mean that. I mean that we have a special relationship with Israel. Israel is an outpost of democracy.
But it did seem like he was acknowledging on some level intellectually that it is inconsistent to have unconditional aid and support at the same time that he in fact has said repeatedly that he unconditionally he does personally and thinks America should unconditionally support Israel. And I'll leave it to the audience to wrestle with how to square that particular circle. But one of the reasons that he raises, so let's just get right into the specifics. He points to what he characterizes as unique freedoms that exist in Israel that are worth defending despite the human rights abuses against Palestinians. And because Palestinians that are also part of other marginalized communities, like gay Palestinians, might be able to avail themselves of the greater freedoms that exist in Israel. So he'll say things like Israel is the only democracy in the region. He'll say things like it's the only place where people can be openly gay and safe. It's a bastion of human rights, et cetera.
There's 1.9 million Palestinians in Israel who vote. They elect legislatures. They're represented in the judiciary, and they can practice freedom of religion. It's the only place in the Mideast where they guarantee protection for gays. There was a pride parade 2 weeks ago in Israel with 150,000 people in Israel, in Tel Aviv and in Jerusalem. At the same time in Iran, they were hanging gays from cherry pickers.
So I want you to break down some of those claims.
Well, I mean, just right off the bat, the idea that Israel is a democracy in the first place, let alone the only democracy, is a sham. Israel rules over millions of Palestinians under occupation. At this point, the Israeli government makes it clear that this occupation is permanent. They have no interest whatsoever in granting Palestinians self-determination or autonomy of any kind. And so Israeli policy, the system is, millions of Palestinians live under Israeli control and they don't get to participate in Israeli democracy.
So RFK Jr., I just want to be as specific as possible here, because I do think that many leftists can say that sort of a thing, but aren't necessarily able to cite with a lot of specificity. So RFK Jr. will say, well, there's Palestinians on the Israeli Supreme Court. Where else in the Middle East will you find Jewish people on a Saudi or Iranian or what have you Supreme Court?
So it's important here to know that there are two categories of Palestinians. There are Palestinians who are living under military occupation, it's usually beyond that, but just the ones who are currently living under Israeli control. There's Palestinians living under military occupation in the occupied territories. Those are the areas that international law says Israel is obligated to withdraw from. And all Israel ever did throughout its history of controlling those territories is entrench its occupation of them. So there was never even the possibility of genuine Palestinian autonomy in those areas. And those Palestinians live under military dictatorship. They have no rights whatsoever. Children get thrown in military detention. They're tried through military courts. Palestinians don't have the right to move from one Palestinian town to another without going through Israeli checkpoints and controls. Access to water is very limited. Most of it is diverted to the use of Israeli settlers, while Palestinians get a fraction of their own water. That's the reality for Palestinians living under occupation. Now, there's also Palestinian citizens of Israel, people who are living within the internationally recognized borders of what is Israel, which is about 80% of the land. And Palestinians there enjoy some rights, but they still experience very, very significant discrimination. They effectively live as second-class citizens. It is true that they can participate in Israeli elections, and they have a little bit more freedom of movement and autonomy and some level of rights and civil rights as well. But the level of discrimination against them is very serious and systematic. For example, Israel is very clear about the fact that the right to self-determination is unique to Jewish people in Israel. That's part of what their nation state law. It is explicitly stated as such. And when Palestinian citizens of Israel, who are, by the way, in the parliament, the very Palestinians whose existence in the Israeli parliament is often touted as a sign of Israeli democracy and plurality, when those Palestinians try to pass a bill to define Israel as a country for all of its citizens, that proposal gets shot down. It doesn't even get voted on. It's just ruled out to not even be discussed on the insistence that Palestinian citizens of Israel are not equal. So that is the defining character of the state.
So what does it mean when you're citing this bill for Palestinians to have all the substantive rights? Help the audience understand what rights, even for Palestinians of the higher tier of access living in Israel.
Yeah. So
how it is still unequal.
For them, there is significantly less funding for education, for housing, for all sorts of things. There are neighborhoods. For example, here's a drastic example that I think people in the U.S. would be able to identify with. We have non-discrimination laws in the U.S. that if somebody decides not to sell you a house or an apartment because of the color of your skin or your ethnic background or your religion, that is immediately grounds for a lawsuit. In Israel, there are housing admissions committees that check on people's quote unquote cultural suitability to live in certain neighborhoods. And that is just quite thinly veiled code for non-Jews who are trying to live in Jewish neighborhoods. So it's really directed at Palestinian citizens of Israel. And also
at times, I did see this issue come up with some Ethiopian Jews. So they are Jewish, but I guess not considered to be equivalent
quite
in some
equal.
way for racial. Exactly. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And the Israeli Supreme Court that RFK Jr., touts as this, again, incredibly humanitarian and progressive institution, basically said that those housing admissions are perfectly legal and there's nothing wrong with what they're doing. That's the reality that exists. There's many, many levels of discrimination, but it is very clearly felt. You're constantly told that you're not equal, you're not a part of. And in every effort in which Israel was making these fake proposals for a peace agreement, when they're swallowing up massive swaths of Palestinian land illegally in the occupied territories, what Israeli politicians consistently proposed is we'll give you the parts that Palestinian citizens of Israel live on. You can have those pieces that can be part of a future Palestinian state. So they're consistently treated as an unwanted minority within, even though they're indigenous people that Israel established itself on top of. And you have most obviously within Israel is the idea that anybody who is Jewish anywhere in the world can move to Israel and become a citizen. But Palestinians who are refugees because Israel drove them out of their homes when it was established, they do not have the right to return and live in what is modern day Israel because they are not Jewish. I mean, it does not get more transparently discriminatory than that. And to hear RFK Jr. talk about, religious freedom being, if you want religious freedom, Israel is the country to be in. I mean, literally the entire foundation of the state is that people of other religions are not equal. That is the foundation of Israel. And that is why they rule out any possibility for a one-state solution moving forward in which Palestinians would be equal. That is considered an existential threat to Israel, but not in any kind of violent way. It's a threat to the apartheid system that privileges one group of people, ethno-religious group over another.
This is the tricky crux of this issue. And this is why I don't want to mischaracterize her. You can go listen to what she said specifically in various interviews. But people like Marianne Williamson, I think, who otherwise, unlike RFK Jr., are sympathetic to occupation and the apartheid treatment and all of those kinds of things. There are people, and obviously this is why Israel was founded in the first place, who believe that because of the unique persecution of Jewish people over time, and specifically because of the horrors of the Holocaust, that there is a legitimacy to having an explicitly Jewish state where there is demographic rigging to ensure that there is never not a Jewish majority, because the earth has proven that otherwise there is no guarantee for the safety of the Jewish community. And I certainly understand why people, especially of a certain generation in proximity to the horror that was the Holocaust, feel that way. But I also can't help but reflect on what that means for plural communities, diverse communities, including the one that we live in here in the United States of America. And I reflect on it as a Black American who certainly, sometimes thinks, hell's bells, maybe they have a point. Maybe we should have a black state because it's not getting great here for us. But I mean, that is obviously not the standard. Whatever you think about it in the abstract, it's not the standard that we've applied in the United States or really anywhere else. And we very much applaud the national goal of protecting the rights of minorities without segregating ourselves or denying access to the vote, to the franchise, simply because it would change the demographic realities of the country. Now, certainly, Republicans and others have tried to thwart immigration and other things because they do want to maintain a quote unquote Christian nation, white replacement, great replacement, all of that stuff. But broadly, nationally, we say that we reject that sort of thing in the mainstream. So I just want to acknowledge that I know that there's going to be some listeners who say, well, isn't there some legitimacy to the idea of a Jewish state? And there are people that I, like Marianne Williams and care about a great deal, who I very much disagree with about that issue. But I think that they would not characterize it as a desire for inequality. They would characterize it as their hand has been forced by history, and this is the only way they can think of to protect the interests of Jewish people against harm.
And frankly, I understand the emotional appeal of that idea. I understand where it comes from. And frankly, in the abstract, there is no opposition to an abstract idea of creating a Jewish state in which Jews are a majority and they control their own faith and all of that. The problem is when you try to implement that in a place where there's already a population living there that is not majority Jewish, and then you manufacture that Jewish majority by driving people off of their land and out of their homes and destroying their homes and towns and villages. I mean, when Israel was created, nearly 600 Palestinian towns and villages were destroyed to ensure that Palestinians who were driven out by the hundreds of thousands would not be able to return. That's the crime. It's not that somebody is emotionally attached to the idea of a Jewish state. It is that in practice, you have committed crimes against other people to make that vision a reality. And
let's talk about that for a second, because one of the claims that RFK made recently was that there wasn't actually a large Palestinian population, that there had always been a significant Jewish population in the region, and the idea that there was a massive population shift that displaced more Palestinians than there were Israelis, that Palestinians had a natural claim to the land. He's disputed that recently in interviews.
In 1922, when the Ottoman Empire collapsed after World War I, we went to war. The Palestinians were on the side of the Ottoman Empire against the Allies. The Jews were on our side. There were more Jews in Palestine at that time than there were Palestinians. But at the end, the Ottoman Empire disappears. And so there's a lot of land that is part of the Ottoman Empire. And the question is, what do you do with that land? Woodrow Wilson and the League of Nations said, what we're going to do is we're going to give it to whoever lives there. Whoever lives on that land now is the sovereign of their own country. Well, they took Palestine and they said, there's half the people, a little over half are Jews, a little under half are Arabs. So we're going to cut it in two, and we're going to give half, part of the Jews, part of the Arabs. But there was so much anti-Jewish, anti-Semitic bigotry at that time that they gave 4/5 of it to the Arabs and 1/5 to the Jews, just a tiny sliver 9 miles across to the Jews, tiny, tiny little piece of land with their sacred sites that were not Muslim sacred sites ever. So, that's how, that was the original distribution.
And moreover, he's gone on to say that there were various points in time at which Israelis offered Palestinians a two-state solution. It was Palestinians that rejected those terms. And now that their bargaining position, as it were, is weakened, they're now complaining that, Israel's borders have become bigger and bigger as they occupy more and more territory, et cetera. So walk us through how you would respond to that if you were, say, in Jimmy Dore or my position as we've interviewed RFK Jr.
Sure. I think there's two parts to this. The first, on the history, it is just simply factually incorrect. It is a propaganda point that even Israeli historians, serious ones, do not repeat. It is purely a propaganda point, this idea that Palestine was mostly empty and that Palestinians were a minority to begin with. it just simply does not check out. Right-wing Israeli historians, serious ones like Benny Morris, acknowledge the fact that it was obviously a Palestinian majority in the land, overwhelming. The percentage of the populations, by the time the UN first suggested dividing the land in 1947 to offer a division, the Jewish population, after massive immigration from Europe, as part of this Zionist project in collaboration with British colonialism, had risen up to about 30% of the population. And in terms of ownership of the land, it was about 7 to 9% ownership of the land. And Palestinians owned the rest of it and were still the clear majority in spite of this massive immigration wave. And when the UN tried to divide the land the first time, they actually gave the majority of the land to the emerging Jewish state. And so Palestinians naturally rejected that initial plan for division. Why would any people anywhere suddenly decide that it's okay for a majority of their land to be taken away from them and given to somebody else? So that rejection came from a well-founded place. Now, if you fast forward to the modern two-state solution, I think starting in the 80s is probably the correct frame of reference for that. Palestinians eventually came around and made a massive compromise to accept the idea of a two-state solution. That is to cede 80% of their historic homeland to what became Israel, because that is Israel as recognized by the United Nations, as supported by much of the world, and as essentially legally no longer being as much in dispute, in exchange for Israel withdrawing from the occupied Palestinian territories, a mere 20% of historic Palestine, just the West Bank, Gaza, and East Jerusalem, where they can establish a tiny Palestinian state. So this was a massive, massive Palestinian compromise, and the way Israel responded to it is by pretending to engage in a peace process, while in reality on the ground, instead of withdrawing from those occupied territories, they were expanding more and more settlements and entrenching their occupation of those areas. So the peace process effectively was a sham. It brings up the example that many Palestinians reference. It's like two people sitting down to negotiate how to eat a pizza, but then the person with more power says, while we're negotiating, you're not allowed to eat, but I'm going to go ahead and start eating anyway. But please, let's keep negotiating about how we're going to divide this. And obviously, the whole thing is just, it's a ploy to continue taking more and more of Palestinian land and making the possibility of genuine Palestinian independence just disappear, while pretending to be engaged in some kind of two-state solution, two-state process. And the end result of that was the failure of this so-called peace process, precisely because of that, because Palestinians saw that there was no possibility for an end to the occupation. Now, I know people dispute some details about exactly how things fell apart at the end, but the Israeli foreign minister at the time in the year 2000, his name is Shlomo Ben Ami, he said that had he been Palestinian, he would not have accepted the Camp David II offer in the year of 2000, which is widely acknowledged as the most generous offer that Israel made towards Palestinians. And so the people who blame Palestinians for allegedly rejecting generous peace offers are basically saying Palestinians should have accepted tiny crumbs that they can pretend are a state, tiny isolated Bandustans in some major areas that are effectively still surrounded by Israeli settlements and fully controlled by Israel. And if they're not willing to accept that, then they're being rejectionist. Well, frankly, they rightly rejected offers that deny them genuine, sincere, and real autonomy, because to live in a situation in which Israel keeps expanding settlements, keeps confining Palestinians to smaller and smaller areas in the middle of the West Bank, just a few major cities, and then still have to go through Israeli restrictions to move around or to leave the area, that is not genuine independence. And frankly, even some Israeli politicians and commentators were saying at the time, we'll give them some pieces, they can call it a state, they can call it fried chicken, they can call it whatever they want. So Israeli politicians at the time were not even making the pretense that they're offering the Palestinians anything serious. And yet, in kind of, at least in American media and political discourse, we have this narrative that the Palestinians rejected generous offers, and it's partly because Bill Clinton's vision was one in which the Palestinians should really cave and stop demanding their rights and just accept whatever crumbs that Israel was willing to offer them. And that's just not the way to go about it.
Can I ask you something that might be a somewhat naive question? What in your mind is the point of continued occupation, expanded settlements at this point in history, when Israel has obviously, by hook and by crook, established itself, occupies the majority of the territory, and arguably would have a much better position from a kind of a global optics perspective, and most certainly from a human rights perspective, if it said, okay, we settled all this stuff, we've claimed it, we've conquered it, I'm going to let go of these occupied territories here and there. And now every time there is, let's say, a terrorist attack or what have you, they would have a better claim of saying that these aren't people fighting for a state and for their freedom. They're people who are fighting for terms that are unreasonable, and we are no longer doing apartheid. We're no longer doing occupations. We're no longer kicking people out of their houses or pouring concrete down water wells. At this point, aren't there diminishing returns on so flagrantly violating international law?
Absolutely. And it's funny, there's a parallel here in relation to U.S. policy towards Israel. You can also say, what does the U.S. get out of supporting Israeli occupation and apartheid? Is that not just harmful to our public image and all of that? And the answer is sometimes narrow political considerations trump what is actually strategically useful and what is morally correct. And I think something similar is happening in Israel as well. There's a very significant shift in Israeli politics to the right. Unlike the US, where younger people are more progressive than earlier generations, in Israel, the younger generation is actually much more anti-Palestinian and much more right-wing. The settler movement is very significant. It carries a lot of weight in Israeli politics. And what we have is a situation in which many Israeli military officials and security officials actually have argued for ending the occupation. But we don't have a situation in Israel right now where the politics allows for that to happen. The shift is completely in the direction of this is God-given land and we have to expand. And partly it's because the cost is really minimal. As long as Israel has the backing of the United States, it can thwart any real and meaningful pressure over it. There's no significant cost for carrying out the occupation. And given the fact that most of the political pressure comes from right-wing forces, I think that inclines Israel very significantly towards continuing and entrenching and expanding that occupation to the extent that they can. And sometimes people bring up security arguments of Israel can't afford to leave these areas. We'll note that Israel faced its most existential threat during the 1973 war with Egypt, when Israel was at its largest. It controlled much more territory than it did today, occupying the entire Sinai Desert of Egypt. And that's when things came really, really close, and they were considering using nuclear weapons to rebuff Egyptian attack. So this idea that expanding territory serves a security function is just proven to be false. And you certainly don't enhance security by building more and more illegal Israeli communities in the middle of Palestinian population centers the way they are in the West Bank. True security can only come if you can resolve the conflict on just terms. And getting justice, that is the true method towards long-standing peace and long-standing security. That has to entail ending military occupation. There's really no way about it. That if you're thinking about this logically and strategically, that is still what is in Israelis' best interest, is to end the occupation.
I just, by the way, pulled up some numbers. In 1947, the internet says that there were a little over 1.3 million non-Jews in the region, and 630,000 Jews in the region. So twice as many non-Jews as Jewish people. By 1948, it says that there were, let me make sure that that's because it's a huge decline for non-Jews, 716,700 Jewish people. So, 100,000 more Jewish people, but only 150,000 non-Jews, down from over 1 million.
I think that is basically the great expulsion that took place in 1948 of Palestinians. Israel announced that it was going to be a state. Palestinians rebelled, and there were immediately, the heavy hand of what became the Israeli military. It was separated military gangs at the time. Started basically going town to town, putting down uprisings, destroying homes, driving people out, committing massacres, and the result of that was the driving out of, at least now the low end estimate is 750,000 Palestinians out of their homes to neighboring areas, first to the occupied territories, but also to Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, and so on. And those people under international law have the right to return to their homes. And, Israel sometimes claims that we didn't drive them out, they just left. well, let's pretend they all picked up to go on vacation in Disneyland. The question is, why can't they return? Like, even if you wanted to argue that we did not drive them out, that still does not answer why you've destroyed their towns and villages and refused to let them return. Of course, we know from Israeli historians that this was very much the plot to begin with, that this was a long-standing Israeli military plan to shift the demographics of the region, and they largely succeeded. And there are many Israeli politicians right now who bemoan the fact that, quote unquote, the job was not done, that they left too many Palestinians behind.
Yeah, this is the thing that is so confusing to me. Like, no matter how you feel about the deservedness of a Jewish state, it cannot be denied. There are many explicit statements that the reason that full Palestinian citizenship, voting rights, self-determination, all of those things has to be denied in Israel is because that there is a belief that if they were allowed full access the same way that Jewish citizens are, that they would be a demographic majority and therefore there would not be a Jewish state. And to the extent that there are the policies that specifically protect the interests of Jewish people, et cetera, that there would be, the vulnerabilities that could potentially exist because they would now be the minority in Israel, in the region. And like, even if taking any value judgment about whether or not you think there should or shouldn't be a Jewish majority in the region out of the equation, like that is a specific, like an explicit acknowledgement that demographic population control is the game. That, like, you can't get around that. And that you are willing to disenfranchise people to keep that reality in place. So we have people in the United States who'll say like, oh, I don't want this number of immigrants to come in or whatever, or I think the nature of America is as a white Christian nation or whatever. But at least on the books is illegal. On the books, right? Not in practice, but on the books is illegal to say things like we're going to rig the immigration numbers to make sure that America stays majority white. Like, that used to be what it was in the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1924 and all of that stuff. But at least post-civil rights era, you're not allowed to do that. But, it doesn't seem like Israel's not ashamed. It's not, there's no like secrecy about admitting that that is the game. And that being the case, it's just very confusing to me that you could argue against it being an apartheid state. And why? Because you can have a gay pride parade. As Neoliberal Tears super listener and call-in participant often notes, gay marriage is not, in fact, legal in Israel. I think there is probably an overstatement in some ways of the rights that exist there. But even granting that there is more kind of cultural freedom for some people, at least in Israel, than in other parts of the Arab world, it's a little like saying, like, America just won World War II. It's the freest place on earth. But there's some black people complaining and it's not an apartheid state. It was an apartheid state. You can say it's a democracy. Okay, America's a democracy, whatever that means. But we haven't even had 100 years of full enfranchisement for substantial parts of America's population.
Yep. Honestly, that's a perfect comparison. And it's remarkable that you have an American political context. Again, we pretend we've moved past that, right? We're saying that's behind. There's widespread acknowledgement that what, the American government did to the Native American population is absolutely horrible. And there's an implication that obviously if this were to happen again today, it's a completely different story. Well, it's happening in Palestine right now. Palestinians are the indigenous population who are being driven out of their homes and off of their land to facilitate that demographic shift. And American policy is to support it. So it's incredible the cognitive dissonance here that people display in simultaneously pretending that we've evolved past our awful past, and yet American foreign policy very much is facilitating today what we pretend we'd be against today had it happened again. It really, what you see in Palestine right now, the parallels with Jim Crow are incredible. I mean, there is footage of Palestinians walking down the street being stopped by an Israeli soldier saying, "Are you Jewish or not?" And when they say, "I'm not Jewish," they say, "Okay, you can't walk here. You have to go walk and, take a different road." And this is happening in the occupied Palestinian territories that Israel is not even supposed to be in. They have no legitimate jurisdiction to be the police there. And yet this is what is unfolding. And people see it and just kind of gloss over it and move on. And to your point about the idea, like, I'm happy to grant that it might be easier to be gay in Israel than in some neighboring Arab countries.
For sure, yeah.
But this idea that because their pride parades are bigger than the ones held in Lebanon, that we should give them a pass on murdering Palestinian children by dropping bombs indiscriminately on civilian areas and stealing people's land, that this is, well, at least they're more liberal in this way or that way. I mean, just it really is incredibly jarring that somebody can pretend to be a moral human being and make that argument that because some narrow liberties are better.
Let's talk about that, because that was one of the more subjectively galling colloquies from RFK Jr.'s recent conversation with Jimmy Dore. Jimmy Dore tried to point to some examples specifically of Palestinian civilians being targeted by the Israeli military. He talked about the recent killings in Jenin. And RFK Jr., we'll put a clip here as, throughout so that you can hear it in his words and not mine. But RFK Jr. Alleged that Israel has a policy. It's not targeting Palestinian civilians, but it has a policy that if a structure is being used by terrorists, by the, whatever, that the building itself becomes a legitimate target. And while he might not love that policy, that is not the same thing as targeting civilians.
Israel, on the other hand, only deliberately attacks military targets. So civilians do get killed, but for example, in Jenin, in the recent battle over Jenin is a bomb factory. It's terrorist bomb factory. But Israel, unlike Russia, which when they have areas like that in Chechnya, or the United States and Iraq, we bomb the whole neighborhood because we're not going to send troops in there who are going to die protecting people.
You're saying Israel does? I know I've covered stories where they bombed schools.
Well, but never deliberately.
Oh, yes.
Oh, in war, listen.
Yes,
war,
that's not true.
Yeah, it is. Israel,
of course,
the
it's
IDF,
true.
Listen, the IDF, Colonel Camp was one of the top military experts in the world.
I've covered these stories.
Well, I understand. And maybe somebody, I'm saying it's a policy. Of course, in war, stuff happens. And you may have individuals who kill a reporter, who do something like that. But the policy of the Israeli military is always only to attack military targets. Now, of course, that doesn't always happen. But let me tell you this. The politics, the military policy of every one of the surrounding nations and of Gaza and of the West Bank is not to attack military targets. It's to attack individual civilian Jews. That is the target.
What do you say to that?
I mean, he's even gone further. He's claimed that Israel is so humanitarian that they go to lengths that even the US and Russia don't go as far in terms of trying to protect civilian life and avoid civilian casualties. And that is belied by the fact that every major human rights organization, once again, documents the fact that Israel engages in, quote, reckless and deliberate killings and indiscriminate bombings of civilian areas. We see it in the fact that entire city blocks had been wiped out in successive bombings of Gaza. We see it in the fact that, here's a point of comparison that I think might be surprising to some people in your audience. For the entire first year of Russia's war on Ukraine, just this past year, we've had a total of 487 Ukrainian children documented to have been killed. In the span of 2 weeks, or not 2 weeks, maybe just a few weeks over one summer in 2014, during Israel's bombing of Gaza, 550 Palestinian children were killed. So if you're telling me that Russia is this awful power that is just blanketing Ukrainian civilian areas with bombs, and they kill over the course of a year fewer than the Palestinian children that Israel killed in the course of 2 months, something here is not adding up. And you have the fact that we have it well documented by video, by independent journalists, about the fact that Israeli snipers have targeted Palestinian activists and journalists and medics. This stuff is available on video. It has been covered in the Washington Post. It's been covered in the New York Times. Not quite nearly as frequently as it should be, or prominently as it should be, but it does exist and it's out there. And you have the instance of Shireen Abu Akleh, the Palestinian American journalist, who just last year was, or a couple of years ago, was murdered by it was last year, murdered by an Israeli sniper. First, Israel pretended that she was killed by a Palestinian gunman. That did not check out. Then they said she was caught in crossfire. That also was investigated and did not check out. CNN, of all news organizations, surprisingly did an investigation and said this was a deliberate and targeted killing, and there were no clashes anywhere in the area. So you have an example of an American citizen and a journalist being killed by an Israeli sniper, and yet you have American politicians walking around telling you that Israel does not kill civilians. I mean, it really is absurd. Even if you don't care about Palestinian lives, if you only care about American lives, you still have grounds to raise issue with the fact that Israel has killed 2 Palestinians last year. There was the infamous death of Rachel Corrie, a young American activist who was run over by an Israeli bulldozer in Gaza 20 years ago. There are these incidents, and when Americans...
I mean, even last month, there was the tear gassing of a hospital, right? Like, you don't even have to go back that far. That's what I think the boldness of some of the things that RFK Jr. said is part of why it's so startling when you're engaging him.
Yeah.
It makes you question your own reality because, you know, even Jimmy Dore was kind of saying this, like, I know I've covered this stuff. Like, what are you saying? And he does. He regularly covers these kind of human rights abuses. But even as he was trying to show RFK Jr. video footage and articles, RFK Jr. kind of started talking over Jimmy, not letting him finish his point, and just would not really engage with the evidence as Jimmy was trying to put it in front of him.
Here's the thing, Briahna. Israeli soldiers, there's a group called Breaking the Silence, in which Israeli soldiers come forward and confess to the crimes if their conscience, is just bearing on them too heavily, confess to the crimes that they've committed in Palestinian areas, to the killing of civilians, to the fact that this was encouraged by their commanders, that the policy was not to care whether somebody is a civilian or not. So to believe RFK Jr. is to believe that every major human rights organization and Israeli soldiers who are coming forward with confessions and video evidence and our own eyes are all conspiring in some kind of anti-Israel conspiracy. I mean, just at what point do we just have to stop and say enough with this nonsense? Just the evidence is truly overwhelming. I don't know how you can continue denying it.
Did you see the exchange he had with a protester, I think just last week, who specifically brought up Shireen Abu Akleh and the way that Rabbi Shmuley kind of interceded on RFK Jr.'s behalf? Did you watch that?
I missed it, no.
Hi, first of all, I would like to thank you for your position on mandates. As a Jewish woman who cares for justice, I do have a question. It's been about a year since U.S. citizen and journalist Shireen Abu Akleh was shot by the IDF. It is known through both video and forensic science that it was definitely the IDF and that they targeted her. Are you willing to commit to calling for Israel to extradite the soldier to the U.S. with body cam for a public U.S. trial? She is a U.S. citizen and justice should be served. Also,
no, wait.
Let me finish. Don't speak over me, sir.
Let's just do one question at a time.
Sir, please let me finish. Also, please,
if you make it quick,
can you also commit to having a conversation one-on-one with Jewish Voice for Peace?
Okay, so wait. Let's be civil about this. What's your name, please?
My name is.
What is it? Thank you for coming tonight. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Israel is a open democracy with a free press.
I didn't ask you, by the way. I asked. No.
Let Bobby will answer in a second.
I
am going to correct misinformation. The IDF has now admitted that this renowned Palestinian journalist probably did die from an Israeli bullet during a shootout against terrorists. She was there covering it. When you said that she was deliberately targeted is an absolute lie.
She was definitely targeted. She had a helmet on.
Wait.
She had a helmet on and she had armor.
She has covered.
There is no way.
She covered dozens
There
of
is
military.
no way. He took a direct shot.
No. She covered dozens of
He should
military.
let me talk.
She covered dozens of military raids. Why did they wait to
It took a direct shot.
They what?
It took a direct shot to get her between the helmet and the armor.
What is your source for this?
What my source? My source is forensics and the video.
I have no source.
And the video.
So Israel conducted a lengthy investigation about this, which is what they do always, and amazingly they admitted it probably was an Israeli bullet, and Unfortunately, there
Mr.
are
Kennedy,
journalists who die.
Mr. Kennedy,
it is tragic.
Don't you think that, Mr. Kennedy, do you not think that this, I am Jewish, do not tell me that. Mr. Kennedy, please don't you believe that the U.S. should be able to adjudicate this? She was a U.S. citizen. She was also a journalist. And again, do you also commit to sitting down with the Jewish Voice for Peace and having a conversation with them, or do those Jewish voices not count? Yes, they do. Thank you.
Okay, enough. Let him respond, and we're going to move on. Go ahead.
I don't know enough about the case to make a judgment about, extradition, and I don't know if we even have an extradition treaty for that particular crime. Or what the basis of it would be in Israel or Palestine or wherever the killing took place. I just couldn't answer your question.
Since Israel is our last, they should be ours. Do you agree? All right. Thank you. You are on record. Thank you.
Go ahead, please.
Yeah, it was interesting because in that instance, sometimes it feels like, is he just ignorant? Because in that moment he was like, I don't know that much about it, which is its own failure. If you were going to be aggressively, conclusively saying things like Israel doesn't target civilians, Palestinians do target Israeli civilians, and to not be aware of something like that or some of the events that Jimmy Dore was trying to flag for him, well, then you're negligent in making those kind of declarative statements in the first place. But it's like, I'm confused because this is a man who has a progressive hero like Dennis Kucinich as his campaign manager, someone who it would seem would know better, but who is taking not just a kind of establishment Democratic Party position on these things, but again, as Marianne characterized it, a 5-10-year-old APAIC position on these things.
Yeah.
Do you have any theories about what's going on here?
I mean, look, it's incredibly out of step with, the not just progressive base, as you mentioned. Honestly, it is out of step with what is mainstream in American politics at this point. His positions are wilder and more right-wing than most. And it seems, I mean, it's hard to know to what extent it's cynically political versus how much of it is deeply felt and just kind of him not being sincerely open to wanting to learn more. Maybe it hits emotionally deeply enough with him that he just does not want to engage with counterpoints. I mean, his points are, any examples, here's my narrative, riddled with falsehoods and inaccuracies and claims that make absolutely no sense and don't correspond to reality, but to some alternative universe. And if you challenge him with opposing facts, well, I'm not familiar with these facts, so I can't engage on them. But the point is, Israel is not perfect, but that's all you can say about it. It's a wonderful, amazing beacon of democracy that isn't perfect. And if you want to say anything more than that, then you're the one slandering Israel, but I can't engage with you on the details about it. And I don't know. I personally tend to be a little bit more jaded by politicians. So my inclination is to suggest this is a political calculus on his part, that he's willing to lose a portion of the progressive base because he thinks this stuff is still important. But I think that also comes from the fact that many old-time politicians in the US are out of step also with the extent to which public opinion has shifted on this issue. The extent to which young American Jews are also diverging from Israel and understanding that those policies do not represent their values. To the extent to which mainstream Democrats at this point favor, by significant proportions, over 60%, limiting military aid to Israel because of Israel's violations of Palestinian rights. I don't think there's adequate awareness. People are still operating with that mindset that to support Israel is politically beneficial. And this is a perception that APAIC itself has played into for a very, very long time. They tout their success, they tout their influence. Israeli APAIC officials at various interviews, this one with Jeffrey Goldberg, a pro-Israel journalist, as many of your listeners would know.
The Atlantic, right.
Yes. One APAIC official speaking to him bragged about the fact that just picked up a napkin off of the table and said, within a couple of hours, I can have the signatures of 70 senators on this piece of napkin, just regardless of what it says on there. So you have a lobby that flaunts its influence wants to maintain this perception that crossing them is just devastating to your political career. And the truth of the matter is, even that is not true anymore. Sure, they do have victories. I don't want to deny it. I mean, look, the point is, Briahna, it's a mixed bag. That's the point.
Summer Lee eked one out.
Exactly.
Somehow. Yeah. But Andrew Levin went down under the weight of the APAIC lobby. Nina Turner obviously went down. Being Jewish didn't even save Andrew Levin from
it's true.
Andy Levin. Yeah.
But you have the number of progressives who are willing to criticize Israel in Congress is growing. The number of people in Congress who are willing to say Israel is an apartheid state and apartheid states are not democracies. You have like 5 members of Congress who have said that, and they've all survived their races. So all I'm saying is I don't want to also diminish the extent to which they have influence. But this idea that it's just the kiss of death to any political ambitions is simply not true anymore. The American public has shifted on this issue. And it's evident.
To that point, there was this poll from March, and I wonder if this is playing into part of the strategy here with RFK Jr., whether or not there's a kind of sense from APAC or other lobbies that because public opinion is shifting toward the progressive point of view, they have to try something different. And maybe the fact that RFK Jr. is characterizing, like, of all people, Debbie Wasserman Schultz as being weak on Israel is as an escalation of some point. So that the poll from March show that after a decade in which Democrats have shown increasing affinity toward Palestinians, their sympathies in the Middle East now lie more with the Palestinians than the Israelis, with 49% versus 38%. Today's attitudes reflect an 11 percentage point increase over the past year in Democrats' sympathy with Palestinians. So there's a real change afoot. And I do wondering if that's provoking a kind of escalation in the narrative and perhaps the recruitment of people like RFK Jr. to not just stigmatize people like Rashida Tlaib or Ilhan Omar, but to fully be stigmatizing establishment members of the Democratic Party like Debbie Wasserman Schultz for not being sufficiently right-wing on Israel.
Yeah, I mean, look, we're getting to the point to where this issue is becoming increasingly partisan, and there's no way around it. Even though the Democratic Party establishment is clinging on to dear life to maintain their pro-Israel support, the extent to which Israel itself has turned into just so blatantly, openly racist and aggressive in their policies and pronouncements is making it more and more difficult for Democrats to take that and just to continue being supportive. And that's forcing the issue a little bit. Republicans see an opening. They see a way to weaponize Israel against Democrats, to turn into a competition about how the Democrats are throwing Israel under the bus. You know, they did it with Obama. They're doing it now with Biden. And it's absurd because under Obama and Biden, military funding for Israel actually went up, not down. And yet you have this narrative that these people are anti-Israel simply because they were willing to occasionally say something critical about settlements or the occupation or this and that. That the Republican position at this point is Israel right or wrong. And the Democratic position is Israel right or wrong, but we'll occasionally criticize them. And that's seen as being way too weak. I think we are heading in a direction where pro-Israel forces see the writing on the wall. Part of the reason why when they campaigned against Summer Lee and Bernie Sanders and many other progressives, they were not raising the issue of Israel. These are organizations, the Democratic Majority for Israel, specifically about Israel. And yet the money and the ads that they bought and ran against progressives did not touch the issue of Israel because they understand this is not a winning issue with progressives and with the Democratic base anymore. They basically smeared them over other, extraneous issues. In the case of Summer Lee, first, she was not pro-Democratic Party enough, and that's part of the campaign against her. And when she won her primary, they shifted to supporting the Republican candidate against her. So clearly it was not about being adequately pro-Democrat. They're just clinging to dear, they're throwing the kitchen sink at people and seeing what sticks. But there is also, I think, a battle that many Americans are not aware of, which is the battle for free speech, which is a very, very serious one in the U.S. We talk a lot about cancel culture and what happens on college campuses or comedians or this and that. Yet we have an unprecedented assault on free expression in the form of legislation that says that boycotting Israel should somehow be punishable by the government.
Absolutely.
And that is by far the most far-reaching assault on free speech and the First Amendment that exists in the United States right now. And it targets Palestinians specifically. We can see how that can become a slippery slope and target other groups as well. But right now, when you think about
Abby Martin, because of her journalistic focus, was affected by those laws that were passed, somewhere in the southeast, Alabama or something like that?
It's many states. It's like half the country at this point, and it's
so it's laws in that case. It was like laws that prohibit you from getting a government contract if you support BDS.
That's right, and it's not just BDS, which is even more broadly. If you just support boycotting Israeli settlement products, that qualifies you under the laws that are being passed. Now, just for reference, Israeli settlements are illegal, and beyond that, they are considered war crimes under international law. So you have states passing laws that say if an American boycotts a foreign country's war crime, then they can be punished by the government by not receiving certain benefits or whatever. And the most egregious case in Texas a few years back, I think it was Hurricane Harvey, if I'm not mistaken, there was a town that said you can't receive hurricane relief, unless you sign this document that says that you don't boycott Israel. I mean, it's completely out of hand. It's insane. Thankfully, the ACLU and other civil rights giants are challenging these laws and defeating them in many places, but this is really still an ongoing battle. The second front in the battle for free speech is about the definition of anti-Semitism. There is an effort to basically redefine anti-Semitism using something called the IRA definition, the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance. That effort was first pushed in Congress under the Obama administration, but thankfully many organizations, including the ACLU, got involved and stopped it from being adopted. And that's basically a definition that says certain forms of criticism of Israel are also anti-Semitism. It conflates the two to a very, very great degree. It says things like demonizing Israel is anti-Semitism, judging Israel by double standards is anti-Semitism, claiming that Israel is a racist endeavor is anti-Semitism. And obviously, when Israel is a racist endeavor, that's the reality of Palestinians who have experienced displacement in the process of creating Israel. You are creating a situation in which speaking honestly about the Palestinian experience would be considered anti-Semitism. And the author of this definition is a man by the name Ken Stern. He said he developed it overly broad and loose for the sake of data collection, foreign data collection, that it was kind of intentionally overbroad. And that when pro-Israel organizations started trying to pass legislation to say that this should be the law in the United States, on college campuses, what defines instances of anti-Semitism, the author himself said this would violate free speech. This would hinder the ability to have open political conversations on college campuses. We should not adopt that definition. Thankfully, between the ACLU and the author of this definition and many others putting pressure, this ended up not passing in Congress. But then when Trump came into office, he passed it as an executive order. So, and Biden has yet to officially repeal it. And we have a reality right now in which pro-Israel forces, again, speak very openly about the fact that this is a tool to shut down discussion. It is a realization that the debate cannot be won on merit anymore. Because of everything that we've talked about in this conversation, the case is so overwhelming that continuing to arm and support an illegal occupation and an apartheid regime is not the way to move forward. And so pro-Israel organizations and operatives are moving in the direction of suppressing speech on this topic. There's also a man by the name of Ken Marcus. He was at the Brandeis Center during the Obama administration, who was bringing many cases. Anytime there's a pro-Palestinian event taking place on a college campus, he would file a complaint with the Civil Rights Office at the Department of Education alleging anti-Semitism. And every time the Department of Education's Office of Civil Rights came back and said, this is not anti-Semitism, this is not anti-Semitic harassment, this is just political speech. And what Trump did is appoint this man as the head of the Office of Civil Rights at the Department of Education during his era. Thankfully, he was pushed out eventually because of his anti-gay views and the fact that he was problematic on many other fronts. But this is very much a concerted effort by people who openly say that what they're trying to do is shut down speech that they consider anti-Israel. And it is absolutely an attempt to stifle free speech and free discussion. And between the laws of trying to restrict Americans' right to boycott and the efforts to saddle students with complaints of anti-Semitism if they criticize Israel, we are facing a very serious free speech crisis.
That's part of why this is so frustrating, is that we're living in a world where, I know that some people dispute this. I have this argument on Rising often enough. But there's evidence of increasing actual anti-Semitic attacks on Jewish populations in the United States, where you have increasingly every other day, there's some story about somebody's speechwriter or campaign staffer who was found on some blog spewing anti-Semitic and or racist comments here, there, and everywhere, where the president of Twitter seems largely indifferent to anti-Semitism on the site. And as long as you're his friend and buddy, he'll let you back on no matter what you say, do, or post. And yet the Republican Party is doing this thing, which used to be considered itself an anti-Semitic trope, which is to substitute the idea of loyalty to Israel or Zionism for a substantive desire to protect the interests, safety, and well-being of actual Jewish people, regardless of citizenship. And similarly, in the free speech context, I put this question directly to RFK Jr. on Rising. And we'll maybe insert some of that here as well.
You've spoken about your, quote, unconditional support of Israel. And at a time when progressives were just kind of tacitly sanctioned in the House for saying, in agreement with the international community, that Israel is an apartheid state, when the Democratic House caucus is passing a resolution saying categorically it is not an apartheid state against what Amnesty International and all these other groups have said, that it's not a racist state. Is that a kind of censorship as well that you're concerned about? Shouldn't elected Democrats, elected House members have the ability to criticize any nation state without it seeming like it's a violation that it needs to be responded to with this kind of a resolution, this kind of codified censorship?
Yeah, I mean, I think people ought to be able to criticize Israel, and I don't think it's anti-Semitic to criticize Israel. Here's the distinction. If you're criticizing Israel and not applying the same standards to neighboring states or other states, in other words, if you're making a special category to criticize Israel that's unique to Israel and letting all the other states do the worse, much worse, that then evinces a bias.
That it seems specific, particularly ironic, given your rise to prominence is largely because of these civil liberties issues, including free speech, that you would sit here on the eve of Congress choosing to tacitly, explicitly sanction Congress members for describing Israel as an apartheid state or as a racist state. A move that undoubtedly is geared toward affecting what they feel like they can say in their political capacity or personal capacity, while at the same time holding yourself out as a kind of free speech absolutist. Don't you see a congressional resolution that condemns their speech as a threat to speech at least as much as some Twitter, or Facebook employee choosing to take down COVID information? I'm not excusing the latter, but can we at least be consistent about the things that we're complaining about here? And it's that, it's not surprising, but it still hasn't stopped being demoralizing to me to see people who I think are rightly championing important issues completely drop the ball, especially when some of the most vulnerable populations in the country and in the world are the ones that are suffering from their lack of integrity.
Yeah. Briahna, I think what you opened with this comment is just worth emphasizing real quick, which is the fact that anti-Semitism is a real and rising problem in the United States. We've seen quite scary shootings at synagogues in recent years. This is a very real problem. It has an extremely disturbing history and signs that it could reemerge with the rise of white nationalism and all sorts of stuff. And the cynical misuse of that charge, when it is so serious, is harmful not just to the people that they target it with, right? Like, people who support Palestinian rights are the obvious direct targets of it. But as you water down that charge by just throwing it around at people who are advocating for human rights, you are harming the people who are also impacted by real anti-Semitism, which is a real and present danger in the United States. And you have, on the right is extremely cynical and self-evidently so. In Trump talking to, using explicitly anti-Semitic tropes about, if you don't vote for me, then you're not adequately loyal, and referring to Israel as your country when speaking to American Jewish audiences, and talking to Jewish, donors and saying, I don't need your money. And there's so much commentary that has come from right-wing politicians about this stuff that gets glossed over by the right But what Democrats have done on the other side is stopped short of going as far as to try to use the law to suppress speech. But I think what you pointed out is right, is that when you pass resolutions condemning criticism of Israel and condemning BDS and this and that, even though you're stopping short of trying to make it illegal, so the clear and present infringement on free speech is a little bit more, murky, you are creating a climate in which advocates of human rights are not allowed to speak up and not allowed to express themselves. And that absolutely does create a chilling effect, even if it's not using the weight of the law to try to suppress what people are talking about. And it's just incredible to be in this climate, as you noted, where we have this significant battle for free speech, and it's on everybody's mind. It's one of the main issues that we're fighting about, left and right, about where to draw the line, about misinformation and this and that. And yet you have this massive assault that just simply does not get addressed and talked about, and it is expanding right before our eyes. And it's a strange exception that people on Twitter try to confront folks with, to say, how come you're not talking about this? But we rarely get a response about it. There's still something that I think has not seen enough public pressure build to really hold people's feet to the fire who claim to be free speech absolutists and advocates, to try to answer for this fundamental assault on free speech that they're refusing to acknowledge or address.
Yeah, I would love to see perhaps Cornel West or somebody outside of the two-party system who has been a principled advocate for Palestinian rights and these kind of civil liberties, generally speaking, raise the hypocrisy that's been presented by some of these other presidential candidates, because I don't know, it's generating disenfranchisement. It's generating people wanting to check out of the system altogether. And I don't fault people for checking out of the two-party system, but there has to be some kind of organized effort if, to your point, you ever want to break through and be able to meaningfully make people accountable for their rank hypocrisy. So we're ending up the session now, but I wanted to get to one of these last points. There were so many things said, it's hard to get through them all. But RFK Jr. said that the Palestinian Authority pays bounties to anyone who kills Jews around the world.
So we give $800 million a year to the Palestinian Authority, which uses that money to pay bounties to Palestinians who kill Jews, not government officials, but Jewish civilians. So if you go to Israel and if you kill a Jew anywhere in the world and you're a Palestinian, the Palestinian Authority will pay you money for that.
I mean, it does not even pass the smell test. You just hear that and you don't know whether to laugh or cry that somebody can make that claim in seriousness. It is completely baseless. It has no relationship to reality whatsoever. And it's funny, right? You could stop there and just say he's inventing stuff. But because I know where that smear comes from, I think it's worth elaborating on just a little bit. What Palestinians have in the West Bank, the authority there, is a system in which any Palestinian who is killed or imprisoned by Israel, their family gets compensation. And the overwhelming majority of people who benefit from that are victims of Israel's brutal occupation. They are victims of Israel's daily violence, just to live without rights under occupation, to use any kind of legitimate means to resist that occupation, to simply be a bystander when Israel decides to escalate its violence. Those are the overwhelming majority of victims. And it's people organizing legitimately against that occupation who end up filling up Israel's dungeons. It's children who are throwing rocks at Israeli tanks that pass down their streets, who end up in Israeli dungeons under military detention. The families of Palestinians who suffer that kind of violence get compensation. And then somebody caught on to the fact that Palestinians who engage in violence are not exempt. Their families are not exempt from that welfare. So people started, finding one example here or there of a Palestinian who committed an act of violence, ended up either being killed or imprisoned by Israel, and saying, how come their families are getting benefits? And the Palestinian Authority's position is, we're not going to dive that deep. Families of any Palestinians who are killed or imprisoned will get benefits. And that started being spun as a program in which the Palestinian Authority is paying people in order to attack Jews, which is just utter and complete nonsense. And expansion of that to say that the Palestinian Authority is offering bounties for people who kill Jews anywhere in the world, I mean, it's just such a grotesque lie. Again, that's the part where it's hard for me to imagine that RFK Jr. is naive enough to hear that and not investigate whether it's true or not. And that's part of the reason why I feel like this must be cynical. This must be serving particular interests who want that kind of rhetoric out there rather than it being sincere, because I can't imagine how anybody would hear that without really questioning or investigating to see whether it's true or not.
It's interesting. Like, Wikipedia treats it like a fact. They have an entry called the Palestinian Authority Martyrs Fund, and they describe it as a fund operated by the Palestinian Authority that pays monthly cash stipends to the families of Palestinians killed, injured, or imprisoned while carrying out politically motivated violence against Israel, not killed, by Israeli forces, regardless of the context, which might have a little bit of A and a little bit of B.
Yeah.
And it also feels like, tell me if I'm wrong, but this feels like one of those situations where the victor writes history, and what might be described by some people as a revolutionary rebel force in an effort to regain one's homeland is somebody else's terrorism. And I'm not saying that there aren't terrorist acts and Israeli civilians that are killed, and Israeli children, and horrible tragedies that befall that are inflicted upon Israelis in this conflict, and that the families of people who might inflict those things might get payouts from the Palestinian Authority. But it does seem like a very different beast, whatever you think of that, than the way that RFK Jr. has described it.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And frankly, beyond just the one man's terrorist is another man's hero, international law is also clear about these dynamics, is that attacks on occupation soldiers are perfectly legitimate under international law. It is every nation's right to resist occupation. And it's very clear that attacks on civilian targets specifically are not legitimate, and those would correctly be identified as terrorism. And there is no question about the fact that every oppressed people in history has resorted to violence to resist that oppression. And some of that violence has been perfectly justified and legitimate, and some of it has crossed the line into something that is immoral. That is also a universal feature of every oppressed population, every colonized population, every occupied population. And in the case of South Africa, we know the history of the ANC being called terrorists, and we know that anybody looking at that situation honestly would not necessarily excuse every act of violence the ANC ever committed, but would understand that apartheid is the fundamental driving force, and that if we were serious and honest about wanting to end the violence for the protection of everyone, we would deal with that driving force and that driving injustice and end it. And this is absolutely what we're witnessing in Palestine and Israel right now. The fundamental driving force is illegal occupation and apartheid. And anybody who's interested in the safety and well-being of Israelis and Palestinians, or one or the other exclusively, should still be advocating for bringing down that apartheid system, because that is the only way we're going to move towards justice that can then enable a long-lasting peace. You have all these programs about if we can only get Palestinians and Israelis in the same room and to talk and to share hummus and whatever else. It's like reconciliation, truth and reconciliation happen after the fall of apartheid. First, you end the political injustice. Then you get people together and talk about forgiveness and clearing the air and working together. But what we have is a completely backwards approach right now, where U.S. policy is continue supporting the political injustice and arming it, but also encourage peace talks and negotiations that are built between oppressor and oppressed. And thank you, Biden, for the humanitarian aid that you throw at Palestinians that Trump had denied them. I don't want to be too glib about it, okay? Maybe it does make a real difference in the lives of vulnerable people, so I don't want to suggest that it's completely trivial. But at the end of the day, Palestinians are not victims of some natural disaster who are in need of American aid. They are victims of a political injustice and an occupation that the United States is funding, and they are in need of freedom from that occupation. And a policy in which we arm the occupiers to commit atrocities against Palestinians and keep them refugees indefinitely, and then throw aid at the refugees to help them survive the predicament that we're funding, is a self-defeating policy transparently, and it's time to start supporting real and meaningful justice.
Yeah, I mean, to not just completely smear Wikipedia, they also do note that the question of whether militants from all political factions will receive such payments from the PA, from the Palestinian Authority, has been highly contested within Palestinian society, with President Mahmoud Abbas withdrawing and then in 2009 restoring such payments for prisoners belonging to the PLO. But the government claims that it does not make such payments to families of prisoners belonging to Hamas or Islamic Jihad. So it is helpful to even, frankly, just know what he's referencing. Because he doesn't say things like, well, according to, the Palestinian Authority Martyrs Fund, he just says things that sound like And it sounds very personal, like deep in the heart of every Palestinian is this desire to kill to kill Jewish people because they're going to get money from it. Like just stuff that feels so generalized and inhumane that that kind of, it doesn't pass the smell test about any group, even like a group of people that I hate. If you told me that like Republicans just want to kill black people to earn money from, I would be like, what are you talking about? Like, it just sounds outrageous, even if I have like substantial disagreements with the politics of the people that we're talking about.
Yeah.
So look, I really appreciate you walking through some of this. We have tried to include as many clips from RFK Jr. so that you can hear it from the horse's mouth. I might have misrepresented things in summarizing, but I really don't intend to. I want to be good faith about this conversation. I think that many listeners and many people broadly on the left were sort of rooting for him, Tyra style. I'm rooting for you. And we're very disappointed by these statements. I think the first time he said a little something about Roger Waters, people were hoping that he would clarify that it's not really what he really meant, but he's been doubling down more and more and more. And this is what it is. So hopefully we get the head-to-head between he and Max Blumenthal. But in lieu of that, I'm so grateful to you, Omar, for joining me here today.
Thank you very much, Briahna. I really appreciate it.
Let the people know where they can find you on the internet and beyond, anything that you've been writing or working on in your professional capacity or otherwise.
Sure. I'm mostly on YouTube, Instagram, and Twitter. And if you just search my name on all of these platforms, you should be able to find me. Okay,
thank you so much. Thank you for listening. A reminder, it's the beginning of the month where I know a lot of people's subscriptions lapse and you get new credit cards and all of those kinds of things. But we really appreciate your support here at Bad Faith Podcast. It enables us to do these kind of deep dives and have access to the wonderful guests like the ones we had today and to keep this show going. I also would really love to maybe staff up a little bit so we can have a little bit more consistency with our guests and have someone who's like specifically working on scheduling and trying to get bigger and better guests. And if you want to facilitate Bad Faith being able to do that, please do subscribe at patreon.com/badfaithpodcast for $5 a month. You get an additional episode every week that drops on Mondays. In both video and audio form. So don't forget about that. Thank you for all you current subscribers. Take care of yourselves. And as always, keep the faith. Hey YouTube, thanks for watching. Just a reminder that this is a podcast. You can catch an extra premium episode every Monday for $5 a month at patreon.com/badfaithpodcast. That's patreon.com/badfaithpodcast for $5 a month, an extra episode every week. Additionally, please do consider liking this video, subscribing to this channel. It helps us out. It helps independent media beat the algorithm. We appreciate you. And as always, keep the faith.